From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
On this edition of Kansas Week, another rate hike is on the table for Evergy customers. We'll tell you about the new settlement that could raise your bill by nearly 10%. Also, a major court ruling on advance voting ballots in Kansas. A federal judge strikes down a state law, calling it an unconstitutional attempt to suppress free speech. But first, the field becomes more crowded this week in the race for Kansas governor. With nearly a dozen candidates already announced, one of the state's most powerful Republicans enters the fray, framing himself as a culture warrior and setting the stage for a contentious primary. We'll discuss those stories and more right now on Kansas Week. Hello and welcome to Kansas Week. I'm Jared Cerullo. The battle to become Kansas' next governor is revving up already, with nearly a dozen candidates from both parties already in the race for more than a year before the election. Among the latest to jump in is one of the state's most powerful figures, Republican Senate President Ty Masterson. He has launched his campaign just this week, framing himself as a culture warrior, touting his record on banning transgender athletes and fighting so-called woke ideology. Masterson's entry shakes up a crowded Republican primary that's already filled with prominent office holders, including former Governor Jeff Collier. Meanwhile, the Democratic field, led by State Senators Cindy Holscher and Ethan Corson, it's also lining up to oppose that agenda, arguing it would drag Kansas backwards. Among our guests this week is Senator Ty Masterson, along with State Representative John Carmichael, Cake News senior political reporter Pilar Pedraza, and Wichita City Councilwoman Becky Tuttle. And in fairness, we offer an open invitation to each of the gubernatorial candidates to appear on this show as soon as it fits into their schedules. Welcome to all of you to this panel today. Senator, I'll begin with you since you've jumped into this governor's race. Number one, tell me why you're running. It's going to be a crowded field. How do you stand out from the other Republican candidates?
Well, thank you for having me on. That's a fair question. It's a crowded field now, right? I think some people lose track. This is a 2026 election, right? The filing deadline formally for this is June of next year, and the election for the primary is not until August. So there's time to get to know the candidates, and I think you'll see those kind of winnow out as time goes, and people learn who's who and who can raise money and who can connect with the people. So I think what makes me different from the crowd here is I'm probably unique in the sense, at least of the major candidates, that I relate to the average Kansan because I am the average Kansan, right? I've gone through personal struggles. I've been up against hard times. I've had bounce backs. I've fought and won victory. So I know what people are going through. I'm probably the only major candidate that can't stroke my campaign $1 million check, out of my own bank account.
What do you mean by culture warrior? What does that mean?
So culture warrior to me, and I mean we use the word, woke gets thrown around. I think woke is really it's what comes from the ideology that I see. They use the term DEI like it's a good thing, and the diversity is a good thing, inclusion's a good thing, but it's become a term thrown around really for an ideology that kind of breeds, in my mind, hatred. I mean, we divide ourselves up by our physical characteristics and tell everybody that there's something wrong with you, and that's not a good thing. We need to love everybody in our community, no matter what they look like or what their background is. So that's the culture war. So that manifests itself in a way of like you mentioned in the lead of keeping biological men out of my girls' sports. I mean, I have 4 daughters and they're all athletes, and it's protecting. It's not just that's a popular issue in Kansas. I say popular. It's widely understood between Republicans and Democrats that that's not a good thing, and so that's how it manifests itself in those. And honestly, the transgender surgeries for children, another thing that's in that culture war that most all people understand is probably not a good thing. So that's probably what I would point to the most in the culture war.
Ty Masterson is a Republican. Representative Carmichael, you are a Democrat. I can only assume you may have a couple of differences.
Ty and people like Ty and the Democrats like me, we've argued and beat this dog-dead horse about woke and DEI and all of these other things to death. But we can talk about the political reality here is that there are so many good high dollar, if you will, candidates on the Republican ballot that what we could see is a plurality nominee coming out of the Republican Party. And I fear, Ty, that it might be Vicki Schmidt, because Vicki is moderate. She's been known to be moderate. She was in the Senate, but she's shown her capability in the insurance commissioner's office this past 8 years. And I think the rest of y'all may be in trouble.
And
I was talking about how we have so many conservatives in this race, and they could easily split the conservative vote that usually dominates in the primary, and thus a moderate actually has a chance this
I was going
time.
to ask John if he's working for Vicki's campaign.
Well, since you brought up Vicki, Representative,
I'm not.
Since you brought up Vicki, I may be wrong here, but I don't think she toes the Republican line on the abortion issue, which will be big.
Historically, I don't think she has towed the party line on abortion. One of the questions will be whether candidates like Vicki Schmidt run to the right for a nomination and join a pack of culture warriors over on the right side of their party, or whether she stays where she's at and attempts to pull off that plurality victory, and then she finds herself positioned as a moderate in the middle in a red state. And it could be a path to victory. I mean, we know historically my party's held Cedar Crest for the past 8 years. And
15 of the last 23.
Thank you. I mean, some days I feel like I'm about the only Democrat who hasn't ran for governor or been governor.
Let me move over to City Councilwoman Becky Tuttle. How does the governor's race, what does the governor's race mean to a city council?
Sure, and especially the largest city in the state of
Yeah.
Kansas, right? And so we have been blessed that we have the Senate president and also the Speaker of the House from our own community. I think that's very helpful. It helps us in Topeka with our legislative agenda that we have, that we do jointly with the county and the Greater Wichita Partnership and the Chamber. So certainly something that I'm keen of. There's 8 Republicans, 3 Democrats already. We still have a long way to go, as you mentioned, not till June of 2026 for the filing deadline. So we will be keeping our eye on it and, just trying to make sure that we're aware of candidates' forums and what their platforms are. But I do want to say, as an elected myself, and to Ty and to Mr. Carmichael, thank you for your service. And I applaud anyone who's willing to run, right? Public service is not easy. We know that. Campaigning is excruciating and hard, but then once you get and are in the role and you really serve, that's when it gets even harder. So anybody who's willing to serve our great state, I'm quite proud of.
Pilar, within about a minute, you're the senior political reporter at Channel 10. From an overall standpoint, what is this governor's race shaping up to be?
It really is shaping up right now on the Republican side to be who's going to stand out, that battle to stand out. And right now, having sat down with the majority of the candidates, Ty obviously just announced I have not done my one-on-one with him yet, and there are a couple of others from Eastern Kansas that I haven't yet. But having sat down with the majority of them and talked with them one-on-one, the only thing that really stood out so far was Vicki Schmidt. Every other candidate that I have sat down with on the Republican side, the word conservative has come up from the candidate half dozen times minimum in the 10-minute interview that we do. Vicki Schmidt, not once. It was mentioned 3 times in her interview by me. She did not use the word once. So that really so far is the only thing that has stood out. I guarantee you, as Ty said, we've got a year to go. Yeah. Other things will come up. We will find out other ways that people stand out. And it's going to be those things that are going to make the difference, because for the most part, as Republicans and on the Democratic side, as Democrats, in general, they have a lot of the same basic beliefs. There's not a whole lot of difference between them. It's finding those points that separate them from the crowd.
Yeah.
We should also remember, we may not have seen all of the candidates.
That's
who
right.
are
There may be more. There may be more. That's right.
Serious candidates on the Republican side who are looking at this, and I think once Dave Toland didn't run, that we may see more Democrats interested in that.
There's
nomination.
11 so far.
On the Democratic side, I found it very fascinating that Laura Kelly tweeted out from her personal account, Laura Kelly KS, in support of Ethan Corson, which she has not mentioned either of the other two.
I was surprised as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
Our next story, a federal judge has permanently blocked a 2021 Kansas law that banned voting rights groups from mailing pre-filled advance ballot applications to voters. In a sharp rebuke, U.S. District Judge Catherine Vrattel wrote that the law was likely passed not to prevent fraud, but to unconstitutionally suppress free speech. Voting rights groups are calling it a major victory for the First Amendment. Kansas Secretary of State Scott Schwab's office maintains the law was needed to reduce voter confusion, but the ruling now clears the way for the groups to resume their outreach. You know, this is an interesting one, too. Is this suppressing free speech? Representative Carmichael, I'll give you the floor first.
I'll try to do this pretty quick. A lot of the origin of this came from Tabitha Lehman when she was the election officer in Sedgwick County, and we mailed out to every registered voter at county expense an application for an advance ballot. And the end result was a lot more advance ballots came in, a lot less people showed up at the polls, shorter lines, less expense. It made sense to do. But some people started looking at the results and said, oh, may have increased Democratic turnout, and maybe that's why we lost some races that year as Republicans. So the county decided, no, we can't afford to have that advance registration sent out to everyone, and so private groups moved into and filled that gap. My Republican colleagues didn't like that, so they made that against the law. It ended up in front of Judge Rattle, a very conservative Republican judge appointed by Bush the First, as I recall, married at one time to John Rattle in the Kansas Senate. And she said now twice that this is not constitutional. It's a restriction on your freedom of speech.
Go ahead, Pilar.
Put in there, when we're talking about those third party sending applications, ballot applications to folks, I actually did a series of investigative pieces because I had voters coming to me confused when they were getting them. And there were a lot of errors that were going on because of that. There were errors in the return addresses, and so when they would fill them out and send them in, they weren't going to the election office, they were going someplace else, and so they thought they had requested a ballot, never got one because they hadn't actually officially requested a ballot. You know, there were people who were freaking out because it came in from some folks partially filled in. And they're like, who's got my private information? Well, it's not actually private information, it's public information. People don't understand that. But there were just so many questions about that. And so that was part of what led to that legislation, certainly. And yes, certainly there was the change in how many people were voting by mail-in ballot.
And as Judge Rattle says in her opinion, the Secretary of State, Scott Schwab, said we had safe and secure elections, and then the next breath he says,
oops,
but we shouldn't allow these advance ballot applications.
Senator, the judge claimed that the defendants did not provide any proof that the law would minimize voter confusion or streamline efficiency. Do you agree?
Well, it might not surprise you that I don't disagree with either John or the judge, right? So, and especially with his characterization of her as a conservative judge. John Rattle, who I knew personally, was probably one of the most liberal members of the Kansas Senate that we've ever seen. So, you know, it's no surprise that you have a judge intervening. We're seeing that a lot now, right? Federal judges intervening in a whole bunch.
They don't live together anymore.
That's right.
I'm saying your characterization is mischaracterization, an end of the issue. And what Pilar brought out is what we were seeing. When you have those pre-filled out, there was no question you had a high error percentage of what the information, because you see that, you'll get magazines at your house or something that have the wrong address. Yep. That was happening on a ballot. I mean, this is your vote. There was a lot of confusion. There were people upset by it, and it does go to the point. We want the most fair election that we can get. Those, and for anybody that takes advantage of that, if you have even a single fraudulent vote, disenfranchises a eligible voter.
Yeah. I did want to also bring out, you talked about efficiency, was when I was doing those stories about those third parties sending out these ballot applications, part of the problem too was people were getting it from 2 or 3 or 4 different third party organizations.
Yes. Well, they talked about that duplicates coming
and
in.
Then and wasting the time of the folks in the election office having to deal with the paperwork over and over and over again for somebody who'd already requested it.
About 14,000 duplicate ballots statewide, which in a 3 million population in a lot of ways isn't that high an error rate, and it's probably pretty typical for what you have on fill out your own applications. People make mistakes.
Most of these were coming to Sedgwick County because they were aimed at groups that traditionally don't vote as frequently, and those are more within the urban area.
I got to move on. I'm sorry. State regulators.
No, I was like, wait.
State regulators putting Evergy officials in the hot seat this week over a proposed rate hike that would raise the average bill by about $9 a month. The Kansas Corporation Commission honing in on why the utility agreed to a $128 million increase when it initially asked for nearly $200 million. Evergy's vice president testified that the company agreed to lower its proposed profit for investors from 10.5% down to 9.7%. A major part of that compromise involves expected revenue from the new Panasonic battery plant in the Kansas City area. Commissioners are stressing their job is to balance company profits with customer affordability, and they will make a final ruling on the rate increase this September. It always, for 20 years, Evergy has raised rates nearly every year, sometimes twice a year. This is, we talk about Evergy raising rates and property taxes. It hurts local property taxpayers, even though this isn't a taxpayer issue, it's an Evergy rate increase. How does it affect your constituency?
Sure, and $9 a month for some people
It's
may
a
not
lot.
be a lot, but
Yeah.
for others it may be, especially those on fixed incomes. The other thing that I think about is the economic development impact. We know that if business and industry is thinking of coming to a community, the two things that they look at first is the infrastructure and the utilities, and then they look at workforce and all the other amenities. And so one of the things that we are striving at the City of Wichita to make sure that we keep our water rates low for that very reason, for our residents obviously, but also for economic development impact. So it's a much bigger issue than even just our neighbors. It's also the economic development part of it.
Senator, how can the state step in? If you want to be governor, what are you going to do to help?
Well, you have a complex issue. That's why you have these governor-appointed KCC to mow through that, because it isn't just. I've never been in favor of a rate increase because affordability is a big issue, especially on top of inflation and all these things. But you have to remember, some of this has been pushed with the green movement. It has pushed our energy to be more expensive to get a particular result. So that adds to all this. You put a requirement on somebody, and then you're upset when they have to go, okay, pay for it. I'm not going to defend Evergy because I don't know what the details were, but that's the point. I can't tell you, but there is a balance between cost and now ever more so reliability. We haven't built a baseload plant in 3 decades in this state, and that reliability, you'll see what you had in Texas when you had the Uri storm. You had too much renewable in the generation mix, and it put the whole place down. We had massive problems, and you have demand coming from data centers, AI, and the consumers are demanding that service, and so that's putting a huge load on.
Representative Carmichael.
Been on the Energy Committee 13 years. Things are the worst today that they have ever been as far as electric rates in Kansas, and Evergy's seemingly insatiable desire for new rate cases as quickly as possible. It's great for their shareholders. The company is doing very well. It's terrible for their customers. We pay at this point 12.5% more on a residential bill than an Evergy customer in Johnson County. Now we're going to add another 9.3%, so it will cost you 21.5% more on your electric bill to be an Evergy customer in Wichita than it does in Johnson County.
And why is that?
We need to equalize
Why
that.
is that? I've never heard that. All of us want to know.
Well, a lot of it is a legacy between the various mergers of the companies over the years. And we could go back to KPL test territory with the KG&E test territory. Wichita got the bad end of the stick. The mergers that Evergy had to create Evergy, as well as the Western Resources, Weststar, we always end up getting the bad end of the stick.
Parties drive for all the green energy, and that's really the result of all that cost has exploded under people like Joe Biden.
I will honestly tell you that I don't think that's the problem, because
it's in the record.
If you don't mind, some of the least expensive energy that we obtain in Kansas is number 1, Wolf Creek, and number 2, wind.
And it was nuclear, and we won't build a plant.
And we're going to talk a little bit about wind here in just a second, but Pilar, go ahead.
A quick point about all of this, though, is you're talking about the cost to consumers, and what most people forget is that as Kansans, we actually pay for it twice. First, we pay for the electricity for our house. That's having the 9% increase. And then every time you go to the store, you're going to pay for it again.
Yep.
Because the stores have to pay more as well for their
And the
electricity,
restaurants.
and the restaurants, and any place else you're going to be spending your money. And guess what? They're going to pass that cost on to the consumer.
And we haven't even talked about transmission delivery charge, which happens automatically.
That's true.
And it's driven by the SPP and FERC's desire to build new power lines all over the Midwest, including in Wyoming, and want us to pay 17% of the bill.
So let's move on to the next story. A massive energy project planned for over a decade is now hitting a major federal roadblock. The Trump administration announcing Wednesday it's canceling a nearly $5 billion loan guarantee for the Grain Belt Express. The project, designated to build a nearly 600-mile high-voltage transmission line that would carry renewable energy from Kansas wind and solar farms eastward. Supporters say it's critical for strengthening the power grid by connecting 3 separate regional energy networks. But the Department of Energy now says the project's finances are too risky, canceling a commitment made by the previous administration, the Biden administration, and casting uncertainty on the future of this long-planned project. So I guess, and forgive, maybe this is a dumb question, but forgive my ignorance, why can't Evergy buy this electricity that we're talking about shipping to Columbia, Missouri?
Because Evergy already has plenty of energy in Kansas. Kansas is a net exporter of electricity. The Grain Belt line, just like the Mulberry line down in southeast Kansas, is not really to bring electricity from Chicago to Wichita or to Ford County. It's to take electricity from Ford County and Dodge City area and send it to Chicago.
But here we are talking about raising Evergy's rates. It's hard to take.
Might have actually found something, John.
Go
I
ahead,
agree
Senator.
there. Right? Because it was here we are. I don't want Kansas to be a power plant for Chicago.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if
Right.
we need, as we talk about our increasing demand for energy, we need our energy here. And there were all kinds of questions around
Look at what
eminent
happened with
domain.
the polar plunge in Texas a few years
Yes.
ago. Their
Yeah.
power went down. They sucked ours out, and we started having rolling brownouts.
I think it's a great example of a green pet project that has been adding
And
cost to the
meanwhile,
people.
up in the Kansas City market, Evergy had a surplus of power. They were selling it, but because of the way the SPP worked, they still had rolling blackouts in Evergy territory when it was exporting power to support Chicago and the rest of the country.
So how do we solve the problem? Is it
One
because
thing we
Evergy is a
deal with-
monopoly?
we deal with the SPP. The SPP has gotten way too big for its
I would agree with him
collective
on that as
britches.
well.
And we need to be willing to do what some other states are beginning to say is, why are we in it?
The cost share is
We're
a
in-
huge factor. You
we're-
mentioned 17%, but that SPP determines how much Kansas pays for some of this transmission.
It
and we have a
also
disproportionate share.
determines what's called the peak reserve margin is, and they've been increasing it dramatically,
Right.
and that's why one of the reasons Evergy said we need to build new generating plants at your expense, Mr. and Mrs. Ratepayer.
Becky Tuttle, anything to add on this one here?
This is not my area
Yeah,
of expertise.
I get it,
but
I get it.
Certainly happy to learn. I was not aware that how much more we pay in Wichita for.
I didn't know that
Yeah,
either.
that's a really interesting fact.
I'd like
I
to see
add
the
one
paper.
point.
I would too.
When we dealt with that polar plunge and we were having those rolling brownouts and rolling blackouts, it's more than just losing electricity, because it also affects, especially in your small towns that are part of this SPC as well, even if they've got a little local municipal utility set up, it still affects them as well. And we had one town, the town of Attica. I actually, right after that happened, I cored emails from the KCC, and through those found that the town of Attica, they actually had a power loss in their natural gas lines because of these rolling brownouts with no warning. They had no warning that it was coming. And they came this close to a massive explosion in that town because of that sudden power loss.
Similar events occurred down in the Coffeyville area in southeast Kansas as well. They were getting gas hammer, is what was happening, and plants nearly blew
Goes
up.
back to reliability, though.
Yeah.
Recent rains have Cheney Reservoir nearly full now, but don't expect your water restrictions to disappear anytime soon. Citing lessons learned from past droughts, city officials in Wichita are proposing a plan to make some water restrictions permanent, even after the current drought is over. The new rules would focus on outdoor irrigation, limiting watering to just 3 days a week and banning it altogether on Sundays. Mayor Lily Wu says the goal is to be proactive to ensure water for future generations. The Wichita City Council will consider this formal proposal next month. Becky Tuttle, I'll start with you on this
Thank
one.
you.
How are we? How do we get it? We got here because of the drought, obviously,
Sure,
but how is the
absolutely.
city council dealing with
And
this?
I talk about drought every single day, and it's hard to talk about drought with residents, and especially the water restrictions. It's even harder to talk about drought when you have flooding, right? But to make sure that people remain vigilant, I say all the time, the most expensive water is the water you don't conserve. So going back again to the economic development impact, if we are in drought and we have business and industry from across the country or the world, and they're looking at Wichita, Kansas, and they see that we're in drought and we are not aggressively addressing it, they are going to be less hesitant to come here because they're afraid we're going to have water rate increases, right? And so we need to just make sure that we're staying vigilant and continuing to conserve water so it will protect it into the future. The other thing is if we're going into the 2 hottest months, and that's where we're going to see the most evaporation in Cheney. And so if we tell our residents, okay, we're in drought, now we're not in drought, then we go back to drought. And so there's a lot of research that says that getting people to conserve water, one of the best ways is to remain consistent.
Permanent.
Yep.
Yeah.
And also I think it's just good stewardship of our most precious natural resource.
Pilar?
That's something that I'm hearing from a lot of our candidates for governor, that they say they're hearing from voters, is that water remains a major concern for them. One thing to think about is because of that flooding, that's not water that's going into the Equispits. That's not water that's going into the Ogallala Aquifer. That's water that's going to keep on going downstream. We're not going to be able to hold on to it. So just because we're having flooding now does not mean that our water shortages are gone.
Exactly right.
Water that comes through the lakes and rivers is temporal. It comes and goes with the seasons, and the second you start to have a dry season, it's gone again for good. There's no way to preserve it really, other than simply not using it. And if we don't refill the aquifer and keep those Equisped charged, we are in deep trouble because we rely on those not just for agriculture, which is the biggest user of them, but simply to have drinking water for every day. And if we don't have drinking water, we don't survive.
Senator Masterson, about 30 seconds.
Oh,
here.
I don't have, my role in that decision is, I'm a Wichita water user.
You are.
I might be okay if they restrict
And
my
over
neighbor to
resident,
Moses
yeah.
6 a.m. But that's the balance they're going to have to cut, right, between preservation of a natural resource and availability to everybody, and then people's individual rights and property rights. I mean, that's a balance they're going to have to strike, but not my decision to make.
Representative?
Suffice to say, it's a problem that will not be solved overnight. It's a long-term plan. As the population continues to grow, demand for water will continue to grow, and at this point we are pretty well at the extent of our current resources. Cities looking at taking your sewer pipe, filtering it, and running it back into your water plant, and that will gain us about 20 million gallons, I think it is a day. Becky probably knows.
That's a wrap for
25
this week. Thank you so much to Ty Masterson, John Carmichael, Pilar Pedraza, and Becky Tuttle for being here. And thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.